Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing the Shia militias in Iraq. Are they a threat just like ISIS? Joining us on the show is Nashashebi, an award-winning journalist and an analyst on Arab affairs. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Why are the Shia militias in Iraq?
Well, when ISIS advanced very rapidly in Iraq, the Iraqi army pretty much melted away, and there were even concerns that ISIS could reach Baghdad. So I think in having to try and fight back, the Iraqi government has relied heavily on the militias, which it had been relying on before, but to a far greater extent now, to defend areas that are still governed by Baghdad. So it's relied heavily on them. The difficulty now, though, is they have reached such a height of power that it might be difficult to roll their influence back, and they operate as a law unto themselves. There are documented reports and evidence of war crimes and other atrocities committed against civilian populations where ISIS have withdrawn. So this is a very real problem, and I think there's potentially a situation where a monster has been created, which is going to be very difficult to roll back, and ultimately we could end up in a situation like Libya, where the country is just awash with militias that are too powerful, that won't submit to central authority, and that are fighting each other.
How come the Iraqi army melted away when ISIS came?
There's a lot of theories. I mean, there's a theory that certain generals and commanders were paid off to melt away by ISIS. There were other theories that they were just simply militarily ill-equipped or unprepared to fight a force such as ISIS. That they were taken by surprise by the speed of the offensive, of ISIS's offensive. So there's lots of different theories, and certainly there were some sackings afterwards because of was seen as incompetence. So there's lots of different theories, but the fact of the matter is it took everyone by surprise how quickly the army pretty much crumbled in the face of ISIS, and that's why around a third of the country now is held by ISIS, and that happened extremely quickly, and it took most people by surprise.
What do you, as you analyse these situations, what do you think the actual situation was? Because there is more than one theory to it.
It's difficult to say. I think certainly there was a level of the Iraqi army just certainly not being capable of taking on a force such as ISIS. I think they underestimated the potential strength of the offensive, and it hadn't been challenged in some years by a force such as ISIS. So I don't think they were just militarily equipped or trained enough to do that. I think the potential for some kind of bribery or corruption is there. I wouldn't discount it, but that's a claim. I think it's probably a mixture of these different things. So it's difficult to pinpoint anything in particular because, depending on someone's agenda, they'll say this was the reason or that was the reason. I think there may be an element of truth in all of them, but it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what was the main reason.
So it's only now natural that there is a Shia militia in Iraq?
I wouldn't say it's natural. I mean, this is a course of action that the government relied on. I think it poses major problems, particularly for the future of the country. And I think what people are overlooking largely is that the militias have been accused by human rights groups of the same atrocities that ISIS is committing as well. So they're not a preference to ISIS. They're not a better alternative. They act in the same way. So you don't want a situation where you have the country divided between these two kind of. Neither of them are government forces. These are militias that are acting as a law unto themselves. So I think this poses a great danger, particularly for the fight against ISIS, because Iraq needs an element of sectarian cohesion to fight ISIS. And the fear of the Shia militias is making Sunni communities reluctant to join that fight wholeheartedly, because they are then attacked when ISIS withdraws from these territories. They are subject to militia attacks. So this is hindering the cohesion that's necessary for a unified fight against ISIS. And ISIS is playing on these divisions by saying, look how these Shia militias treat you. We are here to defend you. And unfortunately, the tragedy for the Sunni community is that they're squeezed between both sides. They're persecuted by ISIS when they take over. If ISIS withdraws, then they're persecuted by the militias that then take over. So it's a very difficult situation for them, and they don't have areas to fall back on. For instance, the Kurds and the Shias have their heartlands that they can fall back on if they are pushed back. The Sunnis don't really. There is distrust between them and the government, between them and the Shia militias, the Kurds. They're persecuted by ISIS, so it's very difficult for them to have a safe place where they can take refuge. So I think the issue of Shia militias has largely been overlooked. But there is a growing body of evidence of their atrocities, I think the world really needs to pay attention that this is a very dangerous problem, particularly with the fight against ISIS, but also for the future of Iraq. I mean, after the campaign against ISIS, what do we do with these militias? Are they readily going to give up their power and influence? Is the government going to stand up to them? Can they stand up to them? So there are lots of questions that need answering.
Do you think the international community has just turned a blind eye on the Shia militias in Iraq?
I think generally, yes, but more generally, the coalition has decided to turn a blind eye to certain factors. In the urgency and haste of fighting ISIS, they have turned a blind eye, for example, not just to the effect of having Shia militias, but also the heavy arming of Kurdish forces. They are accepting whatever situation will help the fight against ISIS without sitting down and considering the consequences of this. The Shia militias are not part of the coalition. I mean, they're part of the other coalition, which is Iran, the Syrian regime, to an extent the government in Iraq. So that's part of a different coalition. I don't think the Western-led coalition has much say in what the Shia militias do. But what it could have done is put pressure on Baghdad to say you have to rein in these militias. It hasn't even done that. But even if it did, I'm not entirely sure that would have any effect. There are effectively two coalitions fighting ISIS. They're not working together. And the only fulcrum really is the Iraqi government, which is involved in both. So I don't think the Western-led coalition has really any say on what the Shia militias do. And there has been fighting, alongside the Shia militias. The Kurdish forces have been fighting alongside them, and they have reported atrocities committed by the militias in plain view of the Kurdish forces, which is quite damning. You have eyewitness accounts, not just from civilians, but also forces fighting with them.
So do you think the government would be able to control the situation?
Not at the moment. I mean, the government is far too weak. It is being propped up effectively by the militias, by Iranian forces, by other militias, Syrian and whatnot. So it's I don't think it has the strength to rein them in. I think it largely, to an extent, owes its existence to the militias propping it up. So there's no way in the near future that it's going to take them on, because it simply doesn't have the power to or the will to. I mean, it's for now it's going to be, there'll be a level of gratitude that they were there to save them. But at some point there's going to have to be a reckoning, because otherwise the country is literally going to be ruled by militia. Or there's going to be a government that is effectively a puppet government of these militias. That can't be the case. And what's worrying is that some of the appointments of the new government now are linked with these militias. So it's not just that the government hasn't been willing to rein them in, but they have taken steps that are actually entrenching their power. I mean, for instance, the new interior minister is affiliated with the Badr organization, which is one of the biggest militias. And there have been other appointments of that sort. So the government is going down a very dangerous path. It's not only reluctant to tackle the issue, but it's entrenching the power of the militias.
But then if the minister is part of, one of the Shia militias organizations, isn't it going to be more effective in the sense that they'll be able to, because they have that political power, at the same time they've joined these militias, they'll be able to stop them after ISIS is hopefully defeated?
In theory, but that we haven't seen any evidence of this so far, that they have put any real pressure on the militias to stop its atrocities. I haven't seen any evidence of that. It could easily go the other way, where suddenly they have such power within the government that they're going to be controlling the government rather than the other way around.
But then what type of atrocities are they actually doing? Because many people defend the Shia militias, saying that they're taking over ISIS and they're defeating ISIS, and they're trying to bring back the land that they stole and that they took over. So what are they actually doing?
Well, they're committing atrocities against civilians in territories where they have ousted ISIS. These are normally predominantly Sunni areas, and it's documented that there have been, what they're called revenge attacks, because they see the population as, if not supportive, then at least complicit in ISIS's strength or popularity. So then they attack these civilians in revenge for this perceived support for ISIS. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, others, they've documented this. There have been accusations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which are the same accusations made against ISIS. So these are very serious accusations, and these attacks, they are accused of acting in a sectarian fashion in doing so. So the actions are no less barbaric than the actions of ISIS. ISIS is getting all the attention, but the seriousness of what is happening in revenge is just as grave.
So when hopefully ISIS is going to be defeated, what's going to happen? Is it just going to be another version of Libya?
Well, the problem is that there is many people have this view that the goal is the defeat of ISIS. That's not the goal. Defeating ISIS doesn't fix the problem in Iraq or Syria. ISIS is a symptom of the situation, and unless the causes are tackled, defeating ISIS on its own is not going to be a problem. After that, you're still going to have the issue of militias, of militia power, of a heavy militarized Kurdish forces. You're still going to have the issue of government abuses in Baghdad and in Damascus. These are going to be issues even after ISIS. And I think people are so focused on ISIS as the problem and the cause to tackle that they're forgetting that you're still going to have these other major problems. None of those other issues are going to be fixed even if ISIS is defeated. So people need to look at the broader picture and to consider, in terms of the steps being taken to fight ISIS, what effect that may be having afterwards. And I think that not enough attention is being paid to that.
Yes, ISIS is believed to be a Sunni group and sect, but they're not really representing the Sunni ideology or practice in what they're actually doing. So what is the actual cause of them? Because you're saying it's kind of like a symptom, and it's just what would actually happen after the situations that have taken place in Iraq and Syria. But then they're not really representing the people themselves. So how would you describe that?
Well, it's a duplicitous game they're playing, because they're claiming to act on behalf of Sunni Islam and calling on Sunnis to come help them. But even a cursory look at the situation, you can easily see how they are treating the Sunni population under their control. It's barbaric, and it's no different to how they're treating the minorities. Again, there's a lot of focus on the atrocities against minorities, which of course is very grave. But they don't treat the Sunnis any differently either. And you can see, for instance, the Iraqi tribes that have risen up in Iraq against ISIS. The response by ISIS has been ferocious, and they're not being. These tribes have been asking for government support to fight back, and they're not being given it. Any kind of Sunni opposition in Iraq or in Syria to ISIS is cracked down on in the most brutal manner. So it's a duplicitous game ISIS is playing. They're calling on support from Sunnis and saying we're acting on your behalf, but they are quite happy to execute, to butcher, to repress, to anyone who under their jurisdiction who doesn't abide by their extremist view of a religious view, which has been rejected wholesale by the spectrum of Islam.
So in this situation, the Sunnis are kind of like attacked in a lot of ways, because they're not really accepted by ISIS because they're being attacked. At the same time, the Kurds are not supporting them, and at the same time, the Shias are also, attacking them, seeking revenge, as you said. So what can actually happen to the Sunnis? Because looking at Iraq as a whole, you have to treat everyone equally, and the Sunnis are a great percentage in Iraq.
Well, the problem with the Sunni community, as you said, they are targeted or mistrusted by all sides in the conflict, but their participation is central. I mean, ISIS cannot exist as it is. Its strength cannot be maintained as it is without a level of support from those territories and communities. But also, fighting ISIS is, if you want to defeat ISIS, you cannot do that without Sunni support. So they are pivotal from the point of view of either side, whether you're ISIS or you're the Western-led coalition or the other coalition. The Sunni community is pivotal. But instead of being wooed, they are attacked on all sides. And this is the real tragedy, is that we haven't learned. I mean, for example, if you look at recent history in Iraq, the fight against Al-Qaeda, I mean, after the US invasion, I mean, George Bush pretty much handed the country to Al-Qaeda. It had unprecedented strength. It didn't even have a presence in Iraq before the invasion. Handed the country over to Al-Qaeda, and it was only with the awakening, the Sunni awakening, that enabled the defeat of Al-Qaeda. And the lesson hasn't been learned from that, is that you cannot defeat these groups without having the Sunni community on side. And at the moment, they're not only embattled by all sides, but they're extremely bitter about that experience with Al-Qaeda, because they suffered great losses fighting Al-Qaeda on the promise that they would be more integrated economically, politically, in the military, and none of this happened. So now, not only are they embattled, but they say, well, we did this before and nothing happened, so why should we do this now? So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, where if they take on ISIS, as some tribes have been doing, they're getting completely cut down without the necessary support. And if they don't do anything, they're perceived as supporting ISIS, so then they get attacked from the other side. It's a really impossible situation for them.
How come the US, as the Sunni tribes already defeated Al-Qaeda, how come they're just giving the weapons to the Kurds and not to these Sunni tribes?
Because I think the US sees the Kurds as the most reliable and stable force. Of the different forces fighting ISIS, if you look at them, I mean, the Syrian opposition groups, they're completely fractured, they're fighting each other, there's no trust or faith in them. The Iraqi army melted away, there's still a lot of mistrust about how effective they are, whether they're corrupt, whether they're sectarian. The Iraqi tribes, again, they are divided between what to do, and there are concerns about where the weapons would end up. So between all these different forces, they see the Kurds as the most stable and reliable. But again, there are potentially very serious consequences even in that, in terms of Kurdish nationalism and the militarization of Kurdish forces. So even then, I think the US is underestimating the effect of putting lots of its eggs in this Kurdish basket, let's say. But it's a very difficult situation. I think this is going to be a problem in the future, potentially in the near future, of highly militarized Kurdish forces that are now cooperating and coordinating with each other in an unprecedented way in Syria and in Iraq, greater tensions in Turkey. This is a potential domino effect that the US has underestimated in its haste to find a reliable partner to arm against ISIS.
But then for them, isn't it better to actually arm the Sunni tribes? Because firstly, they've proved themselves when they took over Al-Qaeda, and they defeated them. So in that sense, they're reliable. At the same time, they're a small minority in comparison to the other ethnic groups and religions in Iraq. So to arm them, isn't it a bit better?
Well, there is that argument, but then I think from the US's point of view, they see, because the Iraqi tribes are, they are not unanimous in terms of their positions. Some of them have risen up against ISIS. Some of them either refuse to because of mistrust of the other parties in Iraq, or they're afraid to. So because of this division within the community, the US may be concerned that if they send arms, they don't know whether those arms are going to end up in ISIS's hands. They don't know whether those arms are going to be used to fight the government in Iraq or the Kurdish forces. It's difficult. So this is why I think they see because the Kurds as the Iraqi Kurdish forces, they are one fighting unit rather than a fractious group. So there is a greater reliability that they know if they send the Kurds the weapons, they're going to remain within that group. So they don't know what's going to happen with the weapons that they send to the Iraqi tribes. They don't really know who to arm within the Iraqi tribes. Some tribes are divided even within themselves about how to respond. And because of there are greater tensions between the Iraqi Sunnis and the government and the Shia militias than there are, for instance, with the Kurdish forces. So to an extent, the reluctance on the part of the US to arm the Sunni tribes under these circumstances, I can see where they're coming from. But as you said, we have to look at the fact that their support, the support of Sunni tribes, is pivotal to any real fight against ISIS.
The thing is, there are many Iraqis in Jordan, and the majority over there, because they had a vox pop recently saying that they are actually supporting ISIS because the Shias are a threat. Why do you think a big community actually believes that the Shias are a threat in Iraq?
Because the militias are a threat. I mean, they have acted as a threat. They have committed atrocities against the Sunni populations in Iraq. And this is the tragedy: is that they are swelling the ranks of ISIS. I mean, I think if the militias had not behaved in the way that they did, I don't think these people would warm to ISIS naturally. They feel threatened, and this is a tragedy. It could have been very different. So you have these populations that would, under any normal circumstance, would have no common ground with ISIS, but they see that these militias are such a threat to them that they're prepared to at least accept ISIS's authority. And that's why I'm saying the fight against ISIS is next to impossible, as long as they have a presence in Sunni areas where the Sunni population feels so threatened by the militias and other forces that they are not willing to rise up against ISIS. And that's a tragedy. We cannot effectively fight ISIS without assuring the Sunni community that they're going to be properly supported in the fight against ISIS, and then after that to be properly integrated in the Iraqi economy, in Iraqi politics, and in society in general.
But then there are many positions in the government that are given to the Sunnis.
There are, but if you look at the Sunni positions in government, many of these Sunni politicians end up complaining that their roles are largely ceremonial, that they're not listened to. So you have this kind of irony that some of the Iraqi Sunni politicians in government end up being among the government's fiercest critics, because they say, well, what are we doing here? It's viewed as simply the government saying, look, we represent all sects in the government. But then these Sunni politicians say, well, yeah, we're in the government, but we don't actually have any say in the government. So this is the problem. It's not that they're not being included; it's that they're not being given any real influence and authority, and they're being excluded from the most powerful ministries as well. So it's the positions that they're given have to have a real influence and role in government. Otherwise, it's a pointless exercise.
But then, when we look at it, shouldn't they, as politicians, being in the position they're in, they would have that power or that influence that they should be able to, make sure their voice is actually heard?
Well, the influence that they have, this is influence that is given within their jobs. I mean, it's difficult for them to create influence if their job is limited from the beginning. And then you have the other problem as well, is that sometimes some of these politicians, when they take up these positions, they are then viewed with suspicion by the Sunni community that say, well, you're selling out, you're not looking out for our interests, you've accepted this role, you're not challenging government enough. So it's a very difficult situation for these politicians. They'll take up a role that A, doesn't have the influence that they hope it will, and then they end up alienating their support base within the Sunni communities. So it's a very difficult situation, but I don't think it's easy for them to take a limited role and then try and expand its influence, because they don't have the means to do that from the outset.
So in all ways, Iraq is just going to keep being divided when it comes to religion and sect.
Well, unfortunately, politically in Iraq, it is a sectarian system where different ministries and different positions are given according to either sectarian interests or the agendas of particular parties, which are then influenced by sectarian interests. So sectarianism is pervasive in Iraqi politics. And as long as this is the case, then there's not going to be any real cohesion between the communities in Iraq, because they're going to constantly be battling themselves, if not on the ground, then in terms of politics, as who controls this ministry, who controls that position, how much influence does this party have. In the long run, this is an untenable situation. As long as positions are given purely on the basis of someone's sect or their affiliation to a party that is affiliated to a sect, that cannot be a long-term functioning polity.
But then when looking at the situation in Iraq, we have the Sunnis who are kind of like warming to ISIS because of what the Shia militias are doing. But then isn't that two kind of wrongs? Yes, what the Shias are doing isn't right, and they should be stopped for, hurting civilians and attacking civilians. But then to join ISIS, being, a religious person that doesn't agree with that, even if a Sunni isn't practicing, but what ISIS's ideology is, it's 100% wrong, because their aim is just to kill and attack, regardless of the person. So to support them, isn't that just as bad as having the Shias there as well?
If you look at the number of the number of the Sunni populations under the control of ISIS, and if you look at the number of ISIS fighters, it's clear that yes, while ISIS fighters are Sunni, the majority of Sunnis in Syria and Iraq have not joined ISIS. They might be living under its control, but that's a very different thing. And this is what I'm saying, is that they are perceived as supporting ISIS because they're not rising up against them. But people need to understand that they pay a huge price for standing up against them. So many of them stay quiet. It doesn't mean that they support ISIS, but they're afraid to fight them because of the revenge ISIS wreaks on them, and then also the mistrust of other forces fighting ISIS. So this has to be put in perspective, that in terms of the Sunni populations under ISIS control, only a minority of them, a small minority, are fighting with ISIS. The rest are staying quiet, and people have to understand that doesn't mean support or complicity. It means that they are afraid. They're afraid of ISIS, and they're afraid of other forces that are fighting ISIS.
So if the Shia militias were to include the Sunni tribes who are willing to attack ISIS, would that kind of like make the situation more better, in the sense, I was going to say peaceful, but I doubt that any peace would actually come out?
I don't think there will ever be a situation where the Shia militias would incorporate the Iraqi Sunni tribes. I think if there was going to be incorporation, the militias and the tribes would need to be incorporated into a national army. This is an exercise that the Libyans tried and have failed completely. But that's really the only solution, because it's the militias and the basis of these militias is too sectarian, either for them to accept Sunni tribal fighters or for the Sunni tribes to say, yeah, we're going to join you. So it can really only be done through a national army, and unfortunately the Iraqi army is ineffective and is being propped up by the militias and foreign forces. So we're not anywhere near a situation where either side is going to be even given the opportunity or willing to join one institution where they'll feel that they have as much say as the other forces that are integrated into it.
We've got Amnesty and other humanitarian groups speaking about the tragic events that the Shia militias are doing in Iraq. Don't they have any influence that they can kind of like stop or have on the government to stop what the Shia militias are doing to civilians?
No, I mean these human rights groups, I mean they can shed light on injustices and atrocities, but they invariably they shed evidence and reports on atrocities by human rights abusers who are inherently unlikely to follow their advice because they're human rights abusers. They call on governments that are allied with Baghdad to put pressure, such as the US, Iran, but neither side has put any pressure, because again they're so focused on ISIS is the enemy, they don't want to create any tensions within their coalitions or their allies, so they're turning a blind eye. So unfortunately the countries and governments that can have an influence on this have chosen not to. But the human rights groups, I don't think they have any influence on the ground. Certainly, in countries where governments are inherently abusers of human rights, they are highly unlikely to listen to human rights groups unless their recommendations are backed up by powerful governments.
But then isn't Iraq thinking of the long run? Like if, when ISIS is going to be defeated, we've got these Shia militias, at the same time we have the Kurds who are heavily armed with weapons. Don't they think what's going to happen next?
I don't think anyone is looking at the long term at the moment. And this is probably the biggest problem now, is that everyone is focused on the short term, on this fight against ISIS, and they're putting all their energies and strategies into this without thinking of the long term. And I think there's a sense of, well, we'll worry about all that later. But the problem is the long term may not be very long term. I mean, after ISIS, post-ISIS, even if there is a post-ISIS, people are talking about the defeat of ISIS. That might not even happen. We may have a situation like with Al-Qaeda where they're rolled back, but they're not vanquished. It's an ideology. It's very difficult to eradicate an ideology. So even if you roll back ISIS, what next will happen? The next day, for example. But people aren't thinking of that. They're just focused on ISIS in a sense because it's easier. You have in a coalition, you need a common enemy. So it's easy to wield this coalition as long as you have ISIS to fight against. Once ISIS isn't that focal point, then what happens to the coalition? Without a common enemy, it kind of tends to break apart. So I think in the cause of maintaining this coalition, people are focusing on one thing and saying, well, if we focus on other stuff, it's going to complicate things, it's going to spoil the coalition, so let's focus on one thing. But all these different problems are interlinked.
But then you're saying that doesn't having a common enemy, isn't that meant to actually bring, the sects together, meaning the Sunnis and the Shia, especially in government? Isn't it meant to make them, unite in the sense that they're all going to be working together against this enemy?
No, because the agendas behind the reasons for fighting ISIS are not the same. So they both have ISIS as a common enemy, but for different reasons. And the overall agendas of the parties to these different coalitions, for example, Iran and the Shia militias, their agenda is very different from, for instance, the US and Britain. The agenda of the Syrian regime is very different to the Syrian opposition. So while they're all fighting ISIS, they have fundamentally different reasons for doing so. So I don't think there's any scope for that kind of cooperation. And as you've seen, you'll have, for instance, Iran and the US, refusing any possibility of working together. And if there is any report of them doing so, they're very quick to deny it very strongly. So this is, I don't think this is something that's going to work. Having a common enemy doesn't mean you work together, because you might have very different reasons for fighting that enemy.
You mentioned in one of your articles that the government is actually denying that there's any Shia militias, attacking civilians. How come, they're not, mentioning it, or at least acknowledging that, the Shia militias are actually killing the civilians?
Well, they're very reliant on these militias. So the government is probably very unlikely to openly criticize or acknowledge militia abuses, because they rely on these militias for its existence. And this is the problem. You have now a government that is reliant on militias. That's now, that these militias hold a lot of sway in the government. So I wouldn't expect anytime soon the government to take a stand against what the militias are doing, let alone even acknowledge that they're doing them. But it's extremely important that recently Ayatollah Sistani came out and said, that the civilian populations have to be treated with respect and dignity. That's probably more important. He's a more important figure to the militias and to the Shia community, really, than the government. So it's important that he's come out and said it. But it's a real shame that the government is not even acknowledging this. But this shows that we're not coming to any time soon where the government is going to stand up and say to the militias, you have to stop, or you have to, let us govern. I don't think we're anywhere near there yet.
But don't you think the politicians in Iraq should at least say it, even if it was indirectly, saying that, if you were to capture a civilian, and because the Islamic religion does speak of this, there are many verses in the Quran, there are many hadiths of the Prophet saying that if you were to capture an enemy, you treat them with all respect, and you don't actually abuse them, because abuse is wrong at the end of the day. But then that isn't actually what's happening. But don't you think the politicians should, say something, even if it was indirectly?
This government is fighting for its survival. It's not going to bite hands that feed it. So now that the militias wield the power that they do, and now that they have the influence that they do over the government is not going to even voice opposition to their tactics. So we run the risk of a puppet government that's in the sway of militias and that has very little real authority.
So with Ayatollah Sistani giving his speech saying, not to attack or hurt civilians, do you think that's actually made the situation better, that Shias are actually listening, Shia militias are listening to him?
Well, he only said this very recently, so I think it's too soon to tell whether that has a change on the ground. Certainly, his authority is undeniable in Iraq, and particularly among the Shia community. So I would hope that this will have a change on the ground. It's too early to tell, though.
But then if we were to have a change in the ground, would it make the situation better?
Of course it would. I mean, anything that will dissipate the mistrust and the open hostility between the Sunni and Shia communities is going to help not just against ISIS, because that's only one facet of the problems in Iraq, but generally in terms of cohesion in Iraq, that this will help. This will help the long term. So anything that supports cohesion and dissipates this mistrust is a good thing.
But then do you think that actual Sunnis would actually then trust the Shias after? Because before they've actually killed civilians, and then maybe now and days to come, they'll be more human, let's say, to the civilians and not treat them badly. Do you think the Sunnis would actually start to trust them and accept what they're doing?
I think so. I mean, as an example, I would state, when the Sunni protests started, this was some time ago, they were particularly in Anbar province, the Sunni protest movement began. Because it garnered support from Shia politicians and forces, Muqtada Sadr, came out and said that their demands are legitimate, and other Shia parties and politicians were telling the government, look, you need to respond to their demands, you need to talk to them. That, I think, was important because it was a movement against the government. It wasn't a sectarian movement against the Shias in Iraq. It wasn't a Sunni movement against Shias. It was a movement against discrimination by the government, because you had Shias saying these demands are legitimate. So that is an example of how, if the communities can see that there are those in other communities that are saying, that these people have a point, that can have a tremendous effect in terms of, in terms of highlighting injustices, that they are injustices based on government rather than sect.
So we need more political people and religious figures that would kind of unite people and say it out.
From all spectrum, I mean, not just politics and religion, from society, from the military, all these different facets of society. As long as there are people standing up and saying this is not a sectarian issue, this needs to be dealt with by the government as an economic issue or a political issue, I mean, this is very important. But I think at the moment now what we've seen is, in light of the last few months in fighting ISIS, is again this extreme polarization of these sects that has really, any progress that was made over the last few years has just died. So we now have to rebuild these steps again to show that it is not just an issue of sect, that these can be transcended, that there are certain problems that transcend sect, and that people can come together over these issues.
You say that, but then when ISIS first went into Mosul and other cities, the Sunnis and Yazidis and Christians that fled and went to places like Najaf, Karbala and other cities, other many Shia-dominated cities, they were welcomed by the Shia people, and they gave them their homes, they gave them, the shrines of the Imams in Najaf and in Karbala were open for these people. So they were, that whole unity was there.
I mean, my understanding, and that has taken place, but my understanding was most of the people that fled from Mosul went to Kurdish territories. I mean, for obvious reasons, territorially they're much closer. So I think most of them fled there. And yes, certainly there are examples of this. But by and large, I mean, it's undeniable that there is a great sense of fear, and justifiable fear, looking at experiences, that where they have fled in other communities, they're either they're either unwelcome because of their sect, or they're distrusted, or they're seen as a burden on the economy and the social fabric of those areas. This is the case with any major refugee population, and not just in Iraq. These problems are being faced in Jordan and Turkey and in Lebanon. So this is there are obviously positive stories, but there is an overwhelming sense that these people are distrusted, that they're not welcome, and that they don't have anywhere to go where they're going to be genuinely taken in.
So it's actually become like the situation in Iraq has become more sectarian than ever before, basically.
Well, I mean, the situation resembles the height of the civil war in 2006, 2007. And there was a sense in the last few years that finally Iraq had picked itself up from those dark days. But we are seeing now the situation does resemble this now. Whereas instead of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, you have ISIS. But yes, certainly Iraq looks woefully divided in a way that it's difficult now to see any light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.